A quiet neighborhood. Maple Street basked in the glow of a setting sun, the horizon painted with hues of orange, pink, and gold. It was that magical time of day when the peaceful suburban neighborhood of Oakwood Hills prepared to settle into the calm of evening. Porch lights flickered on, illuminating the sidewalks with a warm amber glow, and the familiar scent of home-cooked meals wafted through the air as open windows allowed the cooling breeze to sweep in. At the far end of a tree-lined street stood the humble home of Mr. James Carter. Modest and unassuming, the house reflected the quiet dignity of its owner. The white paint had begun to fade in places, and the green shutters had seen better days, but the neatly trimmed lawn and vibrant flower beds spoke of care and attention. It was a home, not just a house, well-loved and full of history. Mr. Carter himself was a figure that many in the neighborhood recognized, though few truly knew. He was tall but slightly stooped with age, his once powerful frame now leaner, his movements slower, assisted by a sturdy wooden cane that had clearly seen as many years as he had. His dark skin, lined with wrinkles, carried the stories of decades gone by, while his silver hair, neatly cropped, gave him a regal appearance. Though his steps were measured, his eyes were bright and sharp, missing nothing that happened in his quiet world. Most of the neighbors thought of Mr. Carter as just a kind, elderly man who lived alone in his small white house. He was always ready with a wave or a friendly word as they passed by, often seated in his old, weathered rocking chair on the front porch. It was his favorite spot, a place where he could watch the world, take in the rhythm of life, and keep an eye on his street. But to the people who waved, who stopped for a brief chat, Mr. Carter was little more than a quiet fixture of the neighborhood. They had no idea who he had once been or what he had done in his long and storied life. For over 40 years, Mr. Carter had lived in Oakwood Hills. He had moved in when the neighborhood was still new, one of the first black families to settle in this part of town. Over the decades, he had witnessed the neighborhood change. New families moved in, children grew up, and the community evolved. He had become a constant presence, like the trees that lined the street, steady, dependable, and quietly strong. Yet behind his peaceful demeanor was a man whose life held more than anyone could guess. The neighborhood kids had their own ideas about Mr. Carter. Some thought he was just an old man who had seen too many winters, while others whispered fantastical stories about his past. They made up tales about him being a retired pirate, a ghost hunter, or even a secret spy. His silence only fueled their imaginations, and though most of them had no ill will toward him, there were a few troublemakers who saw him as a target. One late afternoon, just as the streetlights blinked on, and the last rays of the sun kissed the rooftops, a group of young boys sauntered down Maple Street. They were not from Oakwood Hills, but from a nearby neighborhood, a rougher area known for its troublemakers and mischief. The leader of the group was a boy named Eddie, tall for his age, with a swagger that screamed arrogance. Eddie was the type who thrived on attention and fear. His two sidekicks, Tyler and Jake, followed him everywhere, eager to be part of the trouble Eddie always seemed to find. As they wandered the street, looking for something, or someone, to amuse themselves with, Eddie's sharp eyes landed on Mr. Carter, sitting on his porch in his usual spot, rocking gently in his chair. "Look at the old man," Eddie sneered, nodding toward Mr. Carter's house. "Bet he doesn't even know what day it is. Probably hasn't moved from that chair in years." Tyler and Jake snickered, eager to impress their leader. "What's he even doing out here, huh?" Eddie continued, his voice dripping with mockery. "Bet he's just waiting for someone to push him over. Think we should help him out." The other boys laughed, though there was a nervous edge to it. Even they knew it wasn't right to mess with an elderly man. But Eddie didn't care about right or wrong. He cared about being in control, about proving that he could do whatever he wanted without consequence. As they approached Mr. Carter's house, their laughter grew louder. Eddie led the way, stepping up to the edge of the lawn, his eyes locked on the old man who seemed oblivious to their presence. "Hey, old man," Eddie called out, his voice loud and taunting. You need some help getting out of that chair. We could push you down the street if you're too tired to walk." The boys snickered again, their laughter bouncing off the quiet houses. Mr. Carter didn't move. He continued to rock slowly, his gaze fixed on the street, as though he hadn't even heard them. But Eddie wasn't about to be ignored. He strutted up the front steps, emboldened by the silence. "Did you hear me, old man?" he jeered. "Or are you deaf too?" Tyler and Jake hung back at the foot of the stairs, their grins fading as they sensed something was off. There was an eerie stillness about Mr. Carter that made them uncomfortable, but Eddie didn't notice. He was too caught up in his own bravado. With a final sneer, Eddie reached out to knock the old man's cane out of his hand. But before his fingers even touched the wood, Mr. Carter moved. It was a movement so quick and precise that it took Eddie by surprise. In a fluid motion, Mr. Carter stood, tall and imposing, his eyes locked onto Eddie's with a cold intensity that sent a chill down the boy's spine. For a moment, Eddie was frozen. He hadn't expected the old man to react, let alone move so quickly. He felt a knot of fear tighten in his stomach, but he couldn't back down in front of his friends. "What's the matter, old man?" Eddie tried to laugh, but his voice wavered. "You gonna hit me with that cane?" But Mr. Carter didn't need to say a word. He reached into his pocket and pulled out something small, something shiny. The boys' laughter died instantly when they saw what it was. A badge, a polished, gleaming badge that caught the fading light of the evening sun. The air around them seemed to change, charged with a new tension. Eddie, who had been so full of bravado moments before, suddenly felt his confidence crumble. The badge of authority. The world seemed to stop for a moment as the polished badge gleamed in the fading light, its surface reflecting the orange glow of the sunset. Eddie's smirk melted away as the reality of the situation hit him like a cold gust of wind. The weight of the badge was far more than just a piece of metal. It carried history, authority, and a lifetime of stories unknown to him. For a split second, Eddie's mind raced. He wasn't sure what kind of badge this was, but he knew enough to recognize that it meant power, power that Mr. Carter had in a way he couldn't yet comprehend. His heart raced, and his palms began to sweat. Tyler and Jake, standing a few feet behind him, exchanged uneasy glances, their earlier laughter long gone. Even they, usually as brash as Eddie, could feel the shift in the air. This wasn't just some old man sitting on his porch anymore. This was someone else entirely. Eddie, trying to regain his composure, forced a chuckle, though it sounded hollow in the silence. "What's that supposed to be, huh? Some old security guard badge or something? You think we're scared of that?" But Mr. Carter didn't reply. He didn't need to. The silence was far more intimidating than any words could have been. Slowly, he lowered himself back into his chair, the weight of the moment pressing down on the boys as they stood frozen on the porch. Eddie, trying to shake off his rising anxiety, shifted his feet awkwardly. "What's your deal, old man?" Eddie asked, but his voice had lost its earlier swagger. There was a tremor in it now, a nervousness he couldn't hide. "You think flashing some old badge is gonna scare us off?" Mr. Carter leaned back, resting his cane beside him. His gaze never wavered, calm and steady. And then, in a voice as smooth and steady as the rhythm of his rocking chair, he finally spoke. "Do you boys know what this badge represents?" Tyler and Jake, still hovering at the bottom of the steps, said nothing. Eddie tried to muster his usual bravado, but it wasn't coming as easily now. "No, and we don't care." Mr. Carter's lips curled into the faintest of smiles, but it wasn't a friendly one. It was the kind of smile that carried years of experience, the kind that came from someone who had seen far more than they would ever care to recount. "This badge," Mr. Carter said, holding it up again, "represents decades of service. It represents law, order, and justice. I earned this badge through years of hard work, through struggles you couldn't even begin to understand. This badge isn't just something I carry, it's something I lived." Eddie swallowed hard, but he forced himself to meet the old man's gaze. "What are you? A retired cop or something?" Mr. Carter's eyes narrowed slightly, but he didn't answer right away. Instead, he let the question hang in the air, making Eddie sweat under the weight of his own words. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Mr. Carter spoke again. "Something like that," he said softly. "But that's not the point, is it?" Eddie's heart thudded in his chest. He didn't understand what was happening. This was supposed to be easy, a simple act of messing with some old guy who wouldn't fight back. But now, standing there, staring into Mr. Carter's unflinching gaze, he felt like a little kid again, like he was the one being sized up. And he didn't like that feeling at all. "What's the point, then?" Eddie shot back, trying to salvage some sense of control over the situation. But his voice cracked slightly, betraying his nerves. "The point," Mr. Carter said, his voice low but firm, "is that you're playing a dangerous game, son. You and your friends here. You think you're in control, that you can walk through this world doing whatever you please without consequences. But life doesn't work that way." The weight of his words settled over them like a heavy blanket. Eddie glanced back at Tyler and Jake, hoping to find some encouragement in their faces, but they both looked just as uneasy as he felt. "And trust me," Mr. Carter continued, his voice cutting through the still evening air, "you don't want to test someone like me. I've dealt with boys like you before. I've seen how this story plays out, and it never ends well for your kind. My kind." Eddie snapped, his temper flaring briefly. "What's that supposed to mean?" Mr. Carter's eyes flashed with something dark and hard to define. It was the kind of look that carried a lifetime of pain, struggle, and lessons learned the hard way. "Your kind," he said quietly, "isn't about where you come from. It's about how you carry yourself in this world. You think you're untouchable, but there's always someone bigger, stronger, and smarter than you. Always." The silence that followed was deafening. Eddie, for all his bravado, felt himself shrinking under Mr. Carter's gaze. He had expected an easy victory, an old man who would cower in fear, or at the very least, be too slow to do anything about their taunts. But what he got instead was a man who exuded strength in his stillness, whose words hit harder than any punch. But Eddie wasn't ready to back down. Not yet. He couldn't show weakness, not in front of his friends. "So, what are you gonna do, old man?" Eddie asked, his voice shaking slightly. "You gonna call the cops on us?" Mr. Carter chuckled, a low, rumbling sound that made Eddie's skin crawl. "Call the cops," he repeated, shaking his head slowly. "No, boy. I don't need to call anyone." He leaned forward slightly, his eyes locking onto Eddie's with an intensity that made the boy take an involuntary step back. "I've dealt with punks like you my whole life. And I'll tell you this, you won't be the last to test me. But let me give you a piece of advice. You walk away now, and you might just learn something. You stay, and you'll regret it." Eddie felt a surge of anger rise up in his chest. Who did this old man think he was, talking to him like that? But at the same time, a small voice in the back of his mind whispered that Mr. Carter wasn't bluffing. That maybe, just maybe, this old man was far more dangerous than he seemed. Eddie glanced back at Tyler and Jake again. They were practically frozen, waiting for him to make a move. The pressure of their stares pushed Eddie forward. Without thinking, he lunged, his hand outstretched to grab the badge from Mr. Carter's hand. But before he could even touch it, the old man's cane shot out like lightning, catching Eddie's wrist and sending a jolt of pain shooting up his arm. Eddie yelped in surprise, stumbling back as he clutched his wrist. Mr. Carter hadn't even left his chair. He had barely moved, yet his precision was undeniable. The old man sat there, calm as ever, his cane resting across his lap like a warning. "I told you," Mr. Carter said quietly, his voice as steady as ever. "You don't want to test me." Eddie's face flushed with humiliation and anger. He had been humiliated in front of his friends by an old man who hadn't even broken a sweat. But more than that, he was scared. He didn't understand how Mr. Carter had moved so quickly, so effortlessly. He felt powerless, and that terrified him. For the first time in his life, Eddie realized he might have met someone he couldn't beat. Shadows of the past. The pain in Eddie's wrist pulsed with each heartbeat, but it wasn't the physical pain that bothered him the most. It was the searing burn of humiliation. He had been embarrassed, put in his place by an old man who hadn't even broken a sweat. Eddie's face was hot, his eyes burning with the sting of his bruised pride, as he took a few steps back from Mr. Carter, cradling his wrist in his hand. Tyler and Jake, watching from the bottom of the porch steps, were frozen in stunned silence. They had never seen Eddie rattled like this before. Their leader, the one who always walked with a swagger, always had the sharpest comebacks, the biggest attitude, had just been outmatched by a man old enough to be their grandfather. And not just outmatched, completely shut down. Eddie tried to find his voice, but the words stuck in his throat. How could he respond to this? His bravado had always been his shield, his way of asserting control over every situation. But now, that shield was gone, stripped away by the calm, unflinching presence of the old man sitting in his rocking chair. Mr. Carter, still seated, hadn't moved a muscle after the brief clash. His cane rested across his lap, as though nothing had happened. But the air between them was thick with tension. The badge, now tucked back into his pocket, had made its statement, but there was something deeper in Mr. Carter's eyes, something that spoke of stories untold, of experiences that went far beyond this quiet suburban street. "You boys," Mr. Carter began, his voice low and measured, "you don't know what you're messing with." The words sent a chill down Eddie's spine. It wasn't just a warning. It was a truth. A cold, hard truth that Eddie was beginning to realize too late. But he couldn't just walk away, not with Tyler and Jake watching. Not after everything. "I don't care who you are, old man," Eddie spat, his voice rougher than he intended. "You think you can scare us with some stupid badge and an old cane. You don't know anything about us." Mr. Carter's eyes flickered with something. Was it amusement? Sadness? Eddie couldn't tell, but it unsettled him. "I don't know you," Mr. Carter said, his voice soft, almost too quiet. "Oh, I know more about you than you think." Eddie took a step forward, fists clenched, but he stopped himself. There was something about the way Mr. Carter spoke, the calm in his voice, that kept him at bay. The old man wasn't reacting the way most people did. He wasn't rising to the bait, wasn't feeding into Eddie's anger. Instead, he was disarming it with words, words that seemed to carry the weight of a life far more complicated than Eddie had imagined. "You think I haven't seen boys like you before," Mr. Carter continued, his voice growing firmer now. "Full of fire, full of anger at a world you don't even understand yet. You think you're untouchable because you've never met someone who could knock you down. But let me tell you something, life will knock you down, whether you're ready or not." The rocking chair creaked as Mr. Carter shifted slightly, his sharp eyes never leaving Eddie's. "I've been where you are. Maybe not in the same way, but I've walked those streets. I've fought those battles. And I learned the hard way that pride comes before the fall." Eddie's lips curled into a sneer, but it was more out of discomfort than defiance. "What, you think you're some kind of philosopher now? You're just an old man who got lucky once." A flash of something darker crossed Mr. Carter's face. His eyes, still sharp as ever, seemed to bore into Eddie, as if searching for something deeper inside the boy. "Luck," Mr. Carter said, his voice barely above a whisper. "You think my life was luck." There was a pause, a silence that stretched out uncomfortably, and Eddie felt the weight of Mr. Carter's words sink in. The old man's voice had changed, shifted into something harder, something that carried more than just wisdom. It carried pain. Deep, unspoken pain. "You don't know anything about my life," Mr. Carter continued, his voice now steady, but laced with a quiet intensity. "You don't know what it's like to fight for every inch of respect, for every breath of dignity in a world that wants to take it from you. You don't know what it's like to walk down the street and be judged before you even open your mouth. You don't know what it's like to have your life on the line just for wearing a uniform." Eddie blinked, taken aback. This was a side of Mr. Carter he hadn't expected. The old man's calm exterior had cracked, revealing something raw beneath. Something real. "My life wasn't luck, boy," Mr. Carter said, his voice thick with emotion. "It was hard work. It was sacrifice. It was facing down men who hated me just for the color of my skin. Men who would rather see me dead than allow me to wear this badge." The silence that followed was heavy, almost suffocating. Tyler and Jake, standing at the bottom of the stairs, exchanged nervous glances. Even they, as removed from the situation as they were, could feel the shift in the atmosphere. This wasn't just some old man's lecture anymore. This was something far more personal. Eddie, still holding his wrist where the cane had struck him, shifted uncomfortably. He wasn't used to feeling like this. Vulnerable. Exposed. He had always relied on his bravado to shield him from moments like this. But now, standing in front of Mr. Carter, that shield had been stripped away. "Whatever," Eddie muttered, trying to sound disinterested, but the crack in his voice gave him away. "You don't know anything about me. You don't know what I've been through." Mr. Carter's gaze softened slightly, and for the first time, Eddie saw something in the old man's eyes that wasn't just hard-earned wisdom, it was empathy. "Maybe I don't know your story," Mr. Carter admitted, his voice quiet but filled with understanding. "But I know that anger you carry. I know that feeling of wanting to lash out at the world because you think it's unfair. Because it is unfair." Eddie's breath caught in his throat. He didn't want to admit it, but the old man was speaking the truth. He did carry anger, anger that had been festering inside him for years. Anger at his father for leaving, at his mother for struggling to keep them afloat, at the world for giving him a raw deal. He had bottled that anger up, using it as fuel to control every situation he found himself in. But here, in front of Mr. Carter, that anger felt misplaced. "Why do you care?" Eddie finally asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Why do you even care what happens to me?" Mr. Carter sighed, leaning forward in his chair. His cane rested against his knee, his hands folded together. "Because I've seen where boys like you end up, Eddie," he said, and the way he spoke Eddie's name made the boy's skin crawl with familiarity. "And it never ends the way you think it will." The use of his name hit Eddie like a punch to the gut. He hadn't told Mr. Carter his name. How did he know? The realization must have shown on his face, because Mr. Carter smiled slightly. "You think I don't know who you are. You think I haven't seen you and your friends running around here for months. You're not as invisible as you think." Eddie's face flushed red with embarrassment and anger. He didn't like the idea that this old man had been watching him, knowing more about him than he had ever realized. It made him feel small, powerless. "You can hate me if you want," Mr. Carter said softly, "but don't let that hate drive you into a place you can't come back from." Eddie was silent. His fists were clenched, his mind spinning with confusion and frustration. This was supposed to be easy, just a little fun at the expense of an old man. But now, it felt like he was standing at the edge of something much bigger than himself, something he wasn't sure he could handle. "Life's going to throw a lot at you, Eddie," Mr. Carter continued, his voice calm but firm. "And you can either let it turn you into someone bitter and broken, or you can choose to rise above it. The choice is yours." For the first time that night, Eddie didn't have a comeback. He didn't have anything to say. Mr. Carter had stripped him of his defenses, laid him bare with nothing but the truth. And as much as Eddie wanted to fight it, part of him knew the old man was right. Tyler and Jake, sensing that something had changed, took a step closer to the porch. "Eddie, man, let's just go," Tyler muttered, glancing nervously between Eddie and Mr. Carter. Eddie hesitated, his mind racing. But before he could make a decision, Mr. Carter spoke again. "You don't have to figure it all out tonight," he said, his voice gentle now. "But think about what I've said. The road you're on, It doesn't lead anywhere good, and I don't want to see you go down it." Eddie's heart pounded in his chest. He didn't know what to do. Part of him wanted to lash out, to reclaim his sense of control. But another part, a quieter part, knew that walking away might be the only way to win this battle. Without another word, Eddie turned and walked off the porch, his footsteps heavy on the wooden steps. Tyler and Jake followed close behind, silent and unsure. As they disappeared down the street, the sun finally dipped below the horizon, leaving Maple Street bathed in the deep blue of twilight. Mr. Carter remained in his chair, watching them go, his expression unreadable. The battle wasn't over, not yet, but something had changed, something important. And as the night settled over the quiet suburban street, Eddie couldn't shake the feeling that Mr. Carter had just given him a glimpse of a different path. A path he wasn't sure he was ready to walk, but one that he couldn't ignore. A glimpse into the past. Eddie walked in silence down the dimly lit streets, his mind swirling with thoughts he couldn't quite process. Tyler and Jake trailed behind him, equally subdued. The confrontation with Mr. Carter had left them shaken, but none more so than Eddie. He felt stripped raw, exposed in a way he wasn't used to. The old man's words echoed in his mind like a relentless drumbeat. "The road you're on, it doesn't lead anywhere good." Tyler finally broke the silence. What was all that about, man? That old dude, he was weird. Knew your name and everything. You think he's like ex-cop or something? Eddie didn't answer. He wasn't even sure how to explain what had just happened. Tyler's question gnawed at him too. How had Mr. Carter known so much about him? He had always thought of himself as invisible in the neighborhood, slipping through the cracks without anyone really noticing. But clearly, he had been wrong. Someone had noticed, someone who knew more about him than he was comfortable admitting. "Nah," Eddie finally muttered, though the uncertainty in his voice was clear. "He's just some old guy, probably full of crap, trying to scare us." Jake chuckled nervously, though it lacked any real confidence. "Well, he sure did a good job of it. Man, did you see the way he moved with that cane? Thought for sure he was gonna crack your skull open." Eddie flinched at the memory. The cane had come out of nowhere, quick, precise, almost like a snake striking its prey. But that wasn't the part that bothered him. What haunted him was the way Mr. Carter had looked at him, like he knew exactly what Eddie was going through, like he had lived it himself. On going home, Eddie said abruptly, picking up his pace. Tyler and Jake exchanged glances but said nothing. They knew when not to push Eddie, and tonight was one of those nights. As Eddie disappeared down the street, they lingered for a moment longer before heading in the opposite direction. Eddie's house wasn't far. A rundown, two-story building that had seen better days. The paint was peeling, the gutters sagged, and the front yard was overgrown with weeds. His mom worked long hours as a nurse, pulling double shifts to make ends meet. And his dad, well, Eddie hadn't seen him in years. He had left when Eddie was just a kid, and they hadn't heard from him since. Eddie let himself into the house, the door creaking as it swung open. Inside, the place was dark except for the dull glow of the TV flickering from the living room. His mom, exhausted from her shift, was passed out on the couch, her scrubs still on, a half-eaten microwave dinner on the coffee table in front of her. He paused for a moment, looking at her worn-out figure. The lines on her face had deepened over the years, her hair streaked with gray far earlier than it should have been. She had sacrificed so much for him, but Eddie couldn't shake the feeling that he was failing her, that he was on a path she wouldn't be proud of if she ever found out. Eddie's chest tightened with guilt. He turned away, slipping upstairs to his room. As he closed the door behind him, the weight of the night crashed down on him like a tidal wave. He sat on the edge of his bed, staring blankly at the floor. "I've been where you are," Mr. Carter's voice echoed in his mind again. "And it never ends the way you think it will." What did that even mean? What had Mr. Carter seen in him? And why had his words felt so personal? Frustrated, Eddie kicked off his shoes and threw himself onto the bed. He stared up at the ceiling, his mind racing. He wanted to forget about the whole thing, to brush it off as just another encounter with an old man who thought he knew better. But he couldn't shake the feeling that Mr. Carter's words were more than just empty advice. They carried a weight that Eddie couldn't ignore. The next few days passed uneventfully. Eddie went through the motions of school, hanging out with Tyler and Jake, doing whatever he could to distract himself from the thoughts that kept creeping in. But every night, when he lay in bed, he found himself replaying the encounter with Mr. Carter over and over. The old man's words haunted him, lingering like a shadow he couldn't escape. Finally, after nearly a week of restless nights, Eddie made a decision. He had to know more. He had to figure out what it was about Mr. Carter that had gotten under his skin. He needed to understand why the old man's words had hit him so hard. On a Saturday afternoon, Eddie found himself standing at the corner of Maple Street again, staring down the quiet road. Mr. Carter's house sat at the end of the street, as unassuming as ever. The old man's rocking chair was visible from the sidewalk, but there was no sign of Mr. Carter himself. For a moment, Eddie hesitated. Part of him wanted to turn around and forget the whole thing. But the other part, the part that had been gnawing at him for days, pushed him forward. He needed answers. As he approached the house, the screen door creaked open, and there, stepping out onto the porch with his cane in hand, was Mr. Carter. He looked at Eddie with a raised brow, clearly not surprised to see him. "Back again, huh?" Mr. Carter said, his voice steady as ever. "Figured you might come around." Eddie shifted awkwardly, shoving his hands into his pockets. He hadn't really planned what he was going to say. And now, standing here in front of the old man again, he felt out of his depth. I wanted to ask you something," Eddie finally muttered, avoiding Mr. Carter's gaze. Mr. Carter didn't respond right away. Instead, he eased himself into his rocking chair, the wood creaking softly beneath him. He gestured to the porch step with his cane, a silent invitation for Eddie to sit down. After a moment of hesitation, Eddie sat down on the bottom step, his back against the railing. The two sat in silence for a while, the only sound being the faint rustling of the leaves in the breeze. Finally, Eddie worked up the nerve to speak. "That badge," he said quietly, not looking up. "You were a cop." Mr. Carter's eyes softened slightly, though his expression remained unreadable. He rocked back and forth slowly, as though considering how to answer. "Yeah," he said after a long pause. "I was a cop, a long time ago." Eddie nodded, but he didn't know what to say. He had figured as much, but hearing it confirmed felt strange. Mr. Carter didn't seem like the cops Eddie knew, hard-edged, always ready for a fight. There was something different about him. "Why'd you stop?" Eddie asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Mr. Carter chuckled, though it was a humorless sound. "Time catches up with everyone," he said. "My knees gave out long before I was ready to hang it up. Couldn't do the job anymore, so I had to retire." Eddie could hear the frustration in Mr. Carter's voice, the bitterness of a man forced to leave behind something he had dedicated his life to. "But that's not what you really came here to ask, is it?" Mr. Carter said, his sharp eyes locking onto Eddie. "You want to know why I called you out the other night?" Eddie stiffened, feeling exposed again. He nodded slowly, not trusting himself to speak. Mr. Carter sighed, leaning forward in his chair. "I've seen a lot in my life, Eddie. A lot of good and a lot of bad. And I've seen too many kids like you go down the wrong path because they thought they didn't have a choice." Eddie's heart raced in his chest. How did Mr. Carter know? How could he see through him so easily? "I saw the anger in you," Mr. Carter continued, his voice soft but firm. "The same anger I had when I was your age. And I'm telling you now, that anger will eat you alive if you let it. It'll turn you into someone you don't recognize, someone you don't want to be." Eddie clenched his fists in his lap, his emotions bubbling to the surface. He didn't want to hear this, but at the same time, he couldn't stop listening. "I've been there, Eddie. Mr. Carter said, his voice low and steady. I know what it's like to feel like the world's stacked against you. But you have a choice. You can let that anger define you, or you can use it to push yourself to be better, to rise above it. The weight of Mr. Carter's words pressed down on Eddie like a heavy blanket. He had never heard anyone talk to him like this, so honestly, so directly. And for the first time in a long time, he didn't feel the need to fight back. He didn't feel the need to prove himself. Instead, he felt seen. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the street, Eddie sat in silence, letting Mr. Carter's words sink in. For the first time, he felt like maybe, just maybe, there was a different path he could take. And for the first time, he wasn't afraid to walk it. The weight of the past. The sun hummed low on the horizon as Eddie sat on Mr. Carter's porch, a quietness settling between them. The older man had shared more in the past hour than Eddie had expected, and it was starting to stir things inside him, thoughts and feelings he had been avoiding for years. He sat with his back against the porch railing, staring at the old wooden steps, wondering how a stranger could see so deeply into his life. Mr. Carter rocked slowly in his chair, his cane resting by his side. His expression was calm, but there was a depth in his eyes, a weariness that came with age and experience. Eddie could feel the weight of those years pressing in on him. This wasn't just any old man. Mr. Carter had seen things, lived things, and he had a message Eddie wasn't sure he was ready to hear. But something in Eddie's chest told him he had to keep listening. You don't have to tell me, Mr. Carter began, his voice gravelly yet steady. But I know when I see a young man who's carrying a heavy load. It's not just anger. There's pain behind it, isn't there? Eddie's throat tightened. He didn't want to admit it. Admitting it would mean facing it. And facing it meant vulnerability. He wasn't used to that. In his world, you didn't show weakness. You fought. You hid behind your attitude, your toughness. But here, sitting on Mr. Carter's porch, Eddie felt all those defenses starting to crumble. He hesitated, then finally spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. I don't even know where to start. Mr. Carter leaned forward slightly, the rocking of his chair slowing to a stop. Start wherever you want, son. But just know, whatever it is you're carrying, it ain't too heavy to put down. Not if you're willing to. Eddie sat in silence for a few more moments, staring out at the street. The memories that had been buried for so long started to surface, and with them came the emotions. Rage, hurt, confusion. My dad left when I was 7, Eddie said finally, the words spilling out before he could stop them. Just up and walked out. One day he was there, and the next he wasn't. Didn't say goodbye, didn't leave a note. Nothing. He just disappeared. Mr. Carter listened quietly, his eyes never leaving Eddie's face. My mom, she works all the time, double shifts, triple shifts, whatever she can get, just to keep the lights on. She's never home. It's just me most of the time, and when she is home, she's too tired to even talk to me. So, I guess I got used to being on my own. Eddie's voice wavered as he spoke, the words unlocking something inside him he hadn't allowed himself to feel in a long time. I guess that's why I hang with guys like Tyler and Jake. They don't care about school or jobs or anything like that. They just want to have a good time. And it's easier being with them than being alone. Mr. Carter nodded slowly, his expression thoughtful. It's hard growing up without a father, he said softly. Harder than most people realize. That kind of absence leaves a hole, a wound that doesn't always heal right. Eddie's jaw tightened as he fought back the surge of emotions threatening to overwhelm him. He hated talking about his father, about the man who had abandoned him and his mother. But sitting here with Mr. Carter, it felt different. Like maybe, just maybe, he didn't have to carry all of it alone. I'm angry all the time, Eddie admitted, his voice raw with emotion. And I don't even know why half the time. It's like everything just sets me off. I try to keep it together, but it's hard, you know. Mr. Carter sighed deeply, the sound filled with the weight of a man who had lived through more than his share of hardships. "I know exactly what you're talking about," he said, his voice low. "You think I wasn't angry when I was your age, when I had to watch my family struggle, had to watch my friends get taken down by the system, or worse, by their own bad decisions." Eddie looked up, surprised. Mr. Carter seemed so calm, so composed, that it was hard to imagine him ever being as lost as Eddie felt right now. Mr. Carter shifted in his chair, adjusting his cane as he spoke. "You don't get to be my age without carrying a few scars, Eddie. But the thing is, you've got a choice. That anger, it can either destroy you, or you can use it. It's like fire. It can burn your whole world down, or it can forge something stronger, something better. But it all depends on how you handle it." Eddie frowned, his brow furrowing in thought. No one had ever talked to him like this before. Most adults either lectured him or ignored him altogether. But Mr. Carter wasn't doing either. He was treating Eddie like an equal, like someone who had a choice in his own life. "I don't even know where to begin," Eddie admitted, his voice softer now. "I've been angry for so long, I don't even know what life looks like without it." Mr. Carter nodded again, his expression gentle but firm. "It ain't easy, that's for sure. But you start small. You find one thing in your life that matters to you, something worth fighting for. And you focus on that. You let that be the thing that keeps you grounded. For me, it was my family. Even when everything else was falling apart, I had them to keep me going." Eddie swallowed hard, the lump in his throat growing. "I don't have a family like that," he said quietly. "It's just me and my mom, and half the time, she's too busy working to even notice I'm around." Mr. Carter's eyes softened with understanding. "Family doesn't have to be blood, Eddie. Sometimes, it's the people you choose to let into your life. Friends, mentors, even strangers who see something in you that you don't see in yourself yet." Eddie thought about that for a moment. He had never considered that before, never thought that maybe there were people out there who could help him find a different path. People who cared about him, even if they weren't related by blood. "I don't know," Eddie said finally, his voice heavy with uncertainty. "It all sounds too good to be true." Mr. Carter chuckled softly, a deep, warm sound that seemed to fill the entire porch. "Life's hard, Eddie. Ain't no getting around that. But every once in a while, it gives you a chance to choose something different, something better. And when it does, you've got to be brave enough to take that chance." Eddie looked down at his hands, his mind racing. He had spent so long being angry, so long feeling like he was on his own, that the idea of choosing something different seemed almost impossible. But sitting here with Mr. Carter, for the first time, he felt like maybe it wasn't. Maybe he didn't have to follow the same path as his father. Maybe he didn't have to keep running with Tyler and Jake, doing things that made him feel more lost than found. Maybe he could choose something better. Eddie looked up at Mr. Carter, the older man's eyes still watching him carefully, patiently. "How do you know if it's the right choice?" Eddie asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Mr. Carter smiled, a small but genuine smile that crinkled the corners of his eyes. "You don't," he said softly. "You just have to trust that it's better than the one you're on now." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with truth. Eddie felt the weight of them settle into his chest, pushing aside the anger, the doubt, the fear. For the first time in a long time, Eddie felt like maybe, just maybe, there was a different way. And sitting here with Mr. Carter, he felt like he wasn't as alone as he thought. As the sky darkened into night and the cool breeze swept through the trees, Eddie knew that his journey wasn't over. There were still choices to be made, still battles to be fought. But now, for the first time, he had a glimpse of something better, a future that didn't have to be shaped by the pain of his past. Turning points. The days after Eddie's conversation with Mr. Carter passed in a blur. On the surface, nothing had changed. He still went to school, hung out with Tyler and Jake, and came home to an empty house most nights. But inside, something had shifted. There was a weight to everything now, a pressure that came from knowing he was standing at a crossroads. For the first time in a long time, Eddie felt like he had a choice. He wasn't sure what to do with that realization. It had been so much easier when he believed he was stuck in the life he had. Easier to lash out, to act like nothing mattered, because deep down he'd always figured that his future had already been decided for him. But now, Mr. Carter's words lingered like a stubborn flame, refusing to be snuffed out. You can let that anger define you, or you can use it. The old man's voice echoed in his mind every time he felt himself slipping back into old habits. When Tyler and Jake talked about the next scheme they had in mind, lifting some electronics from a nearby store, Eddie found himself hesitating. He wasn't sure why. He'd been down that road so many times, it had practically become second nature. But now a small voice in the back of his head kept asking, what if you didn't? On the day they were supposed to hit the store, Eddie found himself standing at a different place entirely. Instead of heading to meet Tyler and Jake, he was standing outside Mr. Carter's house again, staring at the familiar porch. It was early in the afternoon, and the neighborhood was quiet. The sun hummed low in the sky, casting long shadows across the street. For a moment, Eddie wondered if he was doing the right thing. Part of him wanted to turn around and walk away, to forget the whole thing and fall back into the life he knew. But the other part, the part that had been gnawing at him ever since that first encounter, pushed him forward. As he approached the porch, the screen door opened, and there stood Mr. Carter, his expression unreadable. His sharp eyes met Eddie's, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. Then, with a slight nod, Mr. Carter gestured toward the rocking chair on the porch. Figured you might come back around, he said simply. Eddie swallowed hard, his heart pounding in his chest as he climbed the steps and sat down in the same spot he had been in days before. The silence between them was thick, but not uncomfortable. It felt like there was no need for small talk. Mr. Carter knew why Eddie had returned. You make up your mind about something? Mr. Carter asked after a moment, easing himself into his chair. His cane rested against the porch railing, and he rocked gently, his eyes never leaving Eddie's face. Eddie nodded slowly. I don't know exactly what I'm doing, he admitted, his voice low. But I know I can't keep doing what I've been doing. I've been thinking a lot about what you said, about choices, about using my anger instead of letting it use me. Mr. Carter smiled slightly, his eyes softening. That's the first step. Realizing you've got more control than you think. Most people never even get that far. Eddie looked down at his hands, the familiar feelings of doubt and fear creeping in. But what if I mess it up? What if I try to change, and I just end up back where I started? Mr. Carter leaned forward in his chair, his expression serious. You will mess up, Eddie. That's part of the process. You're not gonna get it right all the time. Nobody does. But the point isn't to be perfect. It's to keep moving forward, even when you stumble. Eddie nodded, though the uncertainty still weighed heavily on him. I just don't know if I'm strong enough, he admitted quietly. Mr. Carter's eyes flashed with something. Determination, maybe. Strength doesn't mean not being afraid. It means doing what needs to be done, even when you are. The words hit Eddie hard, settling into his chest like a stone. He had spent so long pretending to be tough, acting like nothing scared him. But here, sitting in front of Mr. Carter, he couldn't hide anymore. The truth was, he was terrified. Terrified of failing, terrified of what his future would look like if he didn't change. But more than anything, he was scared of facing the pain he had been running from for years. Mr. Carter seemed to sense the weight of Eddie's thoughts. He leaned back in his chair, the creak of the wood breaking the quiet. You know, I didn't always have it together either, he said, his voice softer now. When I was your age, I was angry at the world. Felt like I didn't belong anywhere. I had dreams of being a cop, but where I grew up, nobody thought that was possible for a black kid from my neighborhood. They told me I'd end up in jail or dead, and for a while, I believed them. Eddie looked up, surprised. Mr. Carter had never talked about his past before, not like this. I made a lot of mistakes along the way, Mr. Carter continued. Got into fights, hung around with the wrong crowd. But there came a point where I had to make a choice. I could let the world decide who I was, or I could decide for myself. And that's what you've got to do, Eddie. You've got to decide what kind of man you want to be. The word hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Eddie felt something stir inside him. A spark, maybe. A flicker of hope that hadn't been there before. For the first time in a long time, he felt like maybe, just maybe, he could be more than what the world had told him he was. But he knew it wouldn't be easy. Changing his life, choosing a different path. It felt like trying to climb a mountain without knowing if there was even a summit at the top. Still, the thought of staying where he was, of continuing down the same road with Tyler and Jake, felt even worse. Mr. Carter's voice broke through Eddie's thoughts. It's not going to happen overnight. But every day you get up and choose something different. That's progress. And before you know it, you'll look back and realize just how far you've come. Eddie nodded again, his heart pounding with a strange mix of fear and excitement. I don't know where to start, he admitted. Mr. Carter smiled gently. You've already started, son. You came back here. You asked for help. That's more than most people ever do. Eddie let the words sink in, the realization hitting him like a wave. He had started. Just by coming back, just by admitting that he wanted something more, he had taken the first step. Now, Mr. Carter said, pushing himself up from his chair with the help of his cane, there's one more thing you need to understand. Eddie looked up at him, curious. The world out there, Mr. Carter continued, gesturing to the street, it's going to try to pull you back into the same old patterns. People like Tyler and Jake, they won't want to see you change. They'll test you, push you, because they're scared of what it means if you actually succeed. But you've got to stay strong. You've got to remember why you're doing this. Eddie clenched his fists, feeling the truth of Mr. Carter's words. He knew Tyler and Jake wouldn't understand. They'd probably mock him for trying to get out, for trying to do something different. But Eddie was tired of being dragged down. He was tired of feeling like his life was on a dead-end street. Mr. Carter placed a hand on Eddie's shoulder, his grip firm but reassuring. You've got a good head on your shoulders, Eddie. Don't let anyone tell you otherwise. You can make something of yourself, something better than what the world expects. But it's up to you to fight for it. Eddie stood, his legs feeling shaky but determined. He looked into Mr. Carter's eyes and saw something he hadn't expected. Pride. Not pity, not condescension, but pride. And that, more than anything, gave Eddie the strength he needed to take the next step. Thank you, Eddie said quietly, the words feeling inadequate for the gratitude he felt. Mr. Carter smiled, his face softening. Don't thank me yet, son. You've still got a long way to go. Eddie nodded, knowing Mr. Carter was right. The road ahead was uncertain, and there would be setbacks. But for the first time, he wasn't afraid of the journey. As Eddie left the porch and walked down the street, the evening sun casting long shadows on the pavement, he felt a sense of resolve settle over him. He didn't know exactly what his future would look like, but he knew one thing for sure. It wouldn't be the same as his past.